People always say the greatest pain is betrayal by someone you love. They are completely wrong. The most agonizing heartbreak is standing in a shadowed corner of an auditorium on your son's graduation day, clutching cheap flowers, watching the very people who destroyed your family sit proudly in the honor seats. It was a day of utter exhaustion for me, yet also the exact moment a brutal truth crashed down upon those who shamelessly stole my sacrifices. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Avery Morris. I stepped through the grand, gilded double doors of the main hall at Crestview Academy, clutching a small bouquet of blue hydrangeas so tightly that my knuckles ached. The air inside was heavy, thick with the expensive perfumes of wealthy parents and the polished scent of old money. It felt suffocating. The towering marble columns and arched ceiling seemed designed to make people like me feel utterly insignificant. Yet, I kept my chin high. I looked down at the soft petals of the blue hydrangeas resting against my chest. They were not the most expensive blooms in the city, but they were Liam's favorite, chosen with a fierce and quiet love. I smoothed my hands down the sides of my ivory silk dress. If anyone looked closely, they might notice the slight imperfections in the hem or the way the seams gathered awkwardly at the waist. I had spent the entire night awake under the dim light of my kitchen lamp, painstakingly tailoring this garment. It was a secondhand find, pulled from a dusty rack at a local thrift store for exactly $15. I had carefully cut and restitched every inch of the worn fabric, praying it would look respectable enough for the most important day of my son's life. I did not want him to look out into the crowd and see a mother defeated by exhaustion. I wanted him to see a woman standing tall. To be here right now, I had to beg my floor supervisor at the Zenith Core Logistics warehouse to let me take half a shift off. The smell of cardboard, industrial tape, and diesel fuel still lingered faintly on my skin, hidden only by a generous spray of a cheap vanilla body mist. I had calculated the bus routes and the walking distance with frantic precision. Rushing across town so I could arrive exactly 30 minutes early, I needed to secure my place before the overwhelming tide of privileged families flooded the hall. Every second counted. As I walked down the long, carpeted aisle, a profound sense of pride swelled in my chest, battling the nervous flutter in my stomach. I am a 42-year-old single mother. For the past 8 years, my reality has been an endless loop of grueling labor. I have worked 14 hours a day, taking on overtime and weekend shifts, sacrificing every ounce of my youth and energy to keep a roof over our heads and food on our table. My hands are calloused, and my back constantly aches. But all of that physical torment melted away in the grandeur of this auditorium. Every heavy box I lifted at the warehouse, every skipped meal, every tear shed in the quiet dark of my bedroom had led to this singular, triumphant morning. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, navigating through the growing crowd of elegantly dressed strangers. My sole objective was the very first row of the auditorium, the VIP section, weeks ago. Liam had come home with a radiant smile, telling me all about the seating arrangements. He had proudly explained how he carefully wrote my name on the designated placement card for the honored families. The thought of that little piece of cardstock bearing my name, resting on a velvet cushioned seat in the front row, was an anchor keeping me steady in this sea of intimidating wealth. I turned a corner near the front of the stage, and there it was, a large, beautifully lettered sign resting on a golden easel. It read, "Reserved seating. Families of valedictorians and top honor students." My breath hitched in my throat, and my heart began to pound a frantic, echoing rhythm against my ribs. The sound was so loud in my own ears I thought the people standing nearby might hear it. This was real. My son, despite the broken home he came from, despite the poverty and the daily struggles we faced entirely on our own, had conquered Crestview Academy. He had reached the absolute pinnacle. I took a deep, trembling breath, adjusting my grip on the $15 silk dress and the damp stems of the blue hydrangeas. I prepared myself to step into the light, ready to find my name waiting for me in the front row, completely unaware of the devastating cruelty that was about to unfold. I stepped forward, allowing a genuine, exhausted smile to break across my face as I reached out to touch the velvet rope separating the front row from the rest of the hall. Just as my foot hovered over the plush carpet of the reserved section, a sharp scent of expensive floral perfume assaulted my senses, completely masking the cheap vanilla mist I had sprayed on myself earlier. A slender arm, dripping with heavy diamond tennis bracelets, shot out like a steel barrier. I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing blocking the narrow aisle was Chloe, the aggressively youthful and impossibly arrogant new wife of my ex-husband. She wore a tailored designer silk suit that probably cost more than I made in 6 solid months at the warehouse. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped the back of a velvet chair, fiercely claiming the territory. Chloe tilted her head, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows arching in a toxic mix of amusement and pure disdain. Her gaze slowly dropped from my weary, lined face down to the damp stems of the blue hydrangeas resting in my hands. Her lips curled into a cruel, mocking smirk, as if she had just spotted a piece of rotting garbage placed on her pristine driveway. "I think you are terribly lost," Chloe said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet venom masquerading as upper-class politeness. "These seats are explicitly reserved for the real family, the people who actually matter today. You need to take your cheap weeds and find a spot in the back row where you belong." My grip tightened around the flower stems until the green thorns pressed painfully into my bare palms. I refused to let her see me crumble. I looked past her sharp shoulder, seeking the one person in this massive room who could intervene. Sitting right beside the aisle, sinking comfortably into his premium padded seat, was Julian, my ex-husband, the man I had scrubbed kitchen floors for. The man whose initial business startup I had funded by working double shifts at a diner over a decade ago. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy suit, his hair perfectly coiffed with expensive products. He was holding his shiny smartphone, intensely swiping and scrolling through meaningless pages. He did not look up. He did not flinch. He intentionally kept his eyes glued to the bright screen, acting completely oblivious to the tense confrontation happening barely 2 feet away from him. He was erasing me. He was actively choosing to treat the devoted woman who had weathered every terrible storm with him as if she were completely invisible, a ghost haunting a life he had discarded. A suffocating, dark wave of suppressed rage washed over me, looking at his perfectly pressed suit and relaxed posture. The bitter, agonizing memories of our divorce rushed back into my mind with violent clarity. I remembered the sickening, cold realization that while I was busy raising our son, cooking our meals, and running our modest household, Julian had been systematically and ruthlessly draining our joint bank accounts. He had quietly transferred properties, hid valuable assets behind complicated dummy corporations, and hired a team of aggressive, merciless lawyers to crush me. When the final court papers were signed, he walked away with a rapidly growing empire and total financial freedom. While I was physically thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing but a battered suitcase and a terrified 10-year-old boy holding my hand, the sheer injustice of it tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. Staring blindly at the glittering diamonds catching the light on Chloe's wrist, my mind was violently yanked back to a freezing, brutal winter night exactly 6 years ago. Liam had taken a terrible fall on the icy, unpaved pavement outside our cramped, unheated apartment building, completely shattering his delicate collarbone. I remembered the sterile, glaring fluorescent lights of the emergency room and the cold, unfeeling voice of the hospital billing administrator demanding an enormous upfront deductible that I simply did not possess. In a state of absolute maternal panic and weeping despair, I had run through the freezing sleet to a dingy, 24-hour pawn shop located in the worst part of town. I stood shivering violently in the flickering neon light and slid my grandmother's antique gold wedding ring across the scratched glass counter. It was my only valuable possession, A deeply cherished family heirloom passed down through generations, and I traded it away to a stranger for a pathetic fraction of its true worth, just to get my little boy the urgent orthopedic surgery he desperately needed. That exact same night, standing alone in the freezing slush outside the hospital entrance, I had dialed Julian's phone number 20 separate times. I wept into his voicemail, begging him for help. I pleaded for him to answer, just this once, for his son. But he kept manually declining the calls, sending me straight to the automated tone. The devastating, soul-crushing truth came the very next morning when I saw the vibrant photographs plastered all over social media. While our son was writhing in physical agony and I was selling my family heritage to survive, Julian was busy hosting a lavish, extravagant wine tasting party at an outrageously expensive beachfront resort down in Miami. He was photographed laughing loudly, toasting with crystal glasses of champagne, completely and utterly unbothered by the shattered pieces of the family he had left behind to rot. Now, standing in this grand, echoing auditorium, the contrast between his cowardly, cruel indifference and my relentless, painful sacrifice burned in my chest like a physical fire. I stared at Chloe's smug, painted face and Julian's pathetic, hidden profile. The primal urge to scream, to tear down the velvet ropes and expose their rotten core right then and there, was overwhelmingly powerful. Before I could unleash the years of suppressed rage burning inside me, a soft clearing of a throat broke the tension. A young, clearly flustered security guard in a crisp white shirt stepped awkwardly between us. His eyes darted nervously from Chloe's intimidating designer presence to my worn dress. He mumbled a quick apology before turning his attention entirely to me. "Ma'am," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am incredibly sorry, but I have to ask you to move. The reserved section is currently at full capacity. The remaining seats have been claimed by this party." He gestured vaguely toward the sprawling entourage of extended relatives and wealthy friends Chloe had brought along, occupying every single chair in the vicinity. "I need to clear this aisle immediately. If you do not have a designated seat, I must ask you to stand over there, in the far corner right next to the emergency exit doors." The humiliation was a physical blow, striking me squarely in the chest. A hot, stinging sensation pricked the corners of my eyes, threatening to spill over into tears. I looked at the young guard, then at Chloe's victorious, sickeningly sweet smirk. The urge to fight, to scream my name and my rightful place at the top of my lungs, was almost overwhelming. But then I thought of the boy who had worked so tirelessly to reach this stage. Today was not about my bruised pride or my ancient battles. It was about his triumph. I absolutely refused to be the cause of a scandalous scene that would ruin his perfect, hard-earned morning. I swallowed the thick, bitter lump of tears forming in my throat. Without uttering a single word of protest, I took a slow step backward. I retreated into the heavy shadows, moving far away from the glowing stage lights. I positioned myself exactly where the guard had pointed, pressing my spine against the cold concrete wall beside the heavy metal exit doors. I stood incredibly straight, pulling my shoulders back, and clutched the blue hydrangeas so tightly against my chest they felt like a protective shield. A sudden, majestic chord resonated from the grand piano at the front of the hall, silencing the murmuring crowd. The traditional graduation march began to play, its slow, rhythmic tempo echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the auditorium swung open, and a wave of pure anticipation washed over the audience. Hundreds of students, dressed identically in flowing academic robes, began their slow procession down the center aisle. My eyes scanned the sea of faces, desperate to find the only one that mattered. And then, there he was. My breath caught in my throat. Liam walked with a quiet, confident grace that made him look older, more formidable than the boy who had left our tiny apartment just a few hours ago. He was striking in his dark blue gown, the rich fabric catching the light with every step he took. Draped heavily around his neck was the bright gold honor stole, a shining testament to his status as the absolute top student of his graduating class. He looked incredibly handsome, carrying the weight of his massive achievements with a humble dignity that brought a fresh wave of unshed tears to my eyes. As he approached the front of the stage, a brilliant, radiant smile illuminated his face. He eagerly turned his head toward the VIP section, his bright eyes searching the front row for the familiar face he expected to see waiting for him. I watched from the dark distance as his gaze swept across the velvet chairs, looking for the placeholder card he had so carefully written. The exact moment he realized my seat was occupied by a stranger, the joyous light completely vanished from his features. His bright smile dropped, replaced by a sudden, sharp look of intense confusion and deep alarm. From his prime vantage point in the front row, Julian finally looked up from his glowing screen. He stood up slightly, offering a broad theatrical wave toward his son, perfectly playing the role of the proud, supportive father for the surrounding crowd. Beside him, Chloe adjusted her posture and flashed a brilliantly fake, camera-ready smile, even raising a manicured hand in a delicate wave. Liam paused his march for a fraction of a second. He looked directly at the man who shared his blood, and the woman who had insulted his mother. The confusion on my son's face instantly hardened into something entirely different. His eyes turned completely cold, devoid of any warmth or recognition. He did not wave back. He did not smile. Instead, he snapped his head away from them and began frantically scanning the vast, crowded expanse of the auditorium, his eyes darting through the dimly lit aisles and shadows. He searched the room with a desperate intensity until, finally, his gaze cut through the darkness and landed squarely on the far back corner by the emergency exit. Across the immense, echoing distance of the massive hall, our eyes locked, even from hundreds of feet away, standing in the cold shadows. I saw the exact moment he registered my presence. He saw my second-hand ivory dress. He saw the cheap flowers clutched desperately to my chest. He saw the isolation imposed upon me by those who felt superior. A terrifying, profound stillness washed over him. I watched as the muscles in his jaw tightly clenched, a distinct, rigid flexing of bone and tendon beneath his skin. It was an expression I knew intimately. It was the exact same look he gave when he was calculating a massive risk, the precise physical tell he exhibited whenever he was desperately trying to suppress an incredibly dangerous, earth-shattering decision. The ceremony dragged on for what felt like an eternity. I stood frozen by the cold metal emergency exit doors, my legs aching from the sheer physical strain, listening to an endless stream of monotonous guest speakers and school board administrators. The heavy air inside the auditorium grew even more stifling as hundreds of names were read aloud for standard diplomas. Every polite clap from the audience felt like a loud ticking clock. I kept my gaze anchored completely on the stage, waiting patiently in the shadows. Finally, after nearly 2 grueling hours, the aging headmistress strode to the center wooden podium. She adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and leaned into the silver microphone. Her voice boomed proudly across the vast room, echoing off the high marble walls, as she prepared to introduce the valedictorian. She spoke at length of his unmatched academic record, his flawless grade-point average, and his exceptional leadership skills. She praised his unwavering dedication and remarkable resilience. Then, with a joyful, booming declaration, she called my son to the stage to deliver the final and most important address of the entire morning. A polite, rhythmic wave of applause rolled through the crowd. Liam stood up from his designated chair on the stage. He walked toward the podium with slow, highly measured steps. He did not look nervous or hesitant. He looked exactly like a seasoned soldier marching fearlessly into a fierce battlefield. He reached the center stage, gripped the outer edges of the heavy wooden podium with both hands, and forcefully pulled the flexible microphone stand closer to his mouth. A sharp, piercing screech of audio static briefly cut through the air, immediately silencing the remaining whispers in the room. He reached inside the deep pocket of his dark blue gown and pulled out a neatly folded stack of thick and cream-colored parchment paper. This was the exact speech he had drafted, The one carefully reviewed and officially approved by the strict academic committee days ago. He unfolded it deliberately, meticulously smoothing the creases. Then, instead of reading the very first line, he held the pages up high for every single person to see. With a sudden, violent, and incredibly deliberate motion, he tore the thick parchment straight down the middle. The sharp, violent sound of tearing paper was amplified heavily by the microphone, cracking like a loud gunshot across the perfectly silent hall. He casually dropped the shredded halves of his carefully approved speech, letting them flutter gently down to the polished hardwood floor below like dead leaves. The sheer disrespect of the action sent a visible shockwave through the faculty sitting directly behind him. A collective, unified gasp rippled violently through the front rows. The headmistress half rose from her velvet seat in sheer shock, her jaw dropping wide open. Liam ignored her completely. He raised his head high and aimed his fierce, unyielding gaze directly over the sprawling sea of wealthy, privileged parents. He bypassed the VIP section entirely, looking straight into the deepest, darkest corner of the massive room where I stood trembling. "I need a massive favor from the control booth." Liam's voice rang out, remarkably steady, incredibly deep, and impossibly loud. "Please take the main stage spotlight off of me right now. I want you to shine it all the way back there, right beside the rear emergency exit doors. Illuminate the woman holding the blue flowers." The lighting technician hesitated for a long, agonizing moment, but the absolute, commanding authority in my son's voice compelled him to act. High above the audience, heavy machinery whirred loudly. A blindingly bright, thick beam of pure white light suddenly cut fiercely across the dusty air of the auditorium. It swept quickly over the heads of the deeply confused audience and slammed directly into me. I instinctively squinted, throwing my free hand up slightly, completely and utterly exposed. Every single shadow that had safely hidden me was violently stripped away. My worn, hand-stitched ivory silk dress, my exhausted, tear-stained eyes, the cheap bouquet of blue hydrangeas pressed desperately against my chest. All of it was suddenly magnified, illuminated fiercely, and displayed boldly for the entire, wealthy world to witness. Loud murmurs of absolute confusion erupted rapidly around me, but Liam cut through the rising noise instantly. "A lot of people sitting in the premium VIP section right now look at me and falsely assume they know my entire story," Liam announced, his tone razor-sharp and echoing with a deeply righteous anger. "They look at the outrageously expensive tuition of this academy and automatically assume my success was easily bought and paid for by the man currently sitting in the very first row. They think my high academic honors are the direct result of lifeless, hollow bank checks or the comfortable, easy life inside a luxurious, sprawling mansion. They firmly assume a wealthy father's deep pockets smoothly paved my way to this prestigious podium." He paused for a long, heavy second, letting the massive weight of his words hang suffocatingly in the air. "But that is a complete, utter, and disgusting lie." Liam gripped the microphone even tighter, his knuckles turning pure white under the stage lights. "The man who shares my genetics, the man casually enjoying the premium seating today, completely abandoned us when I was just 10 years old. He left my mother with absolutely $0, completely frozen bank accounts, and a terrifying mountain of uncertainty. My presence on this stage today has absolutely nothing to do with his money." Liam's strong voice broke slightly, suddenly filled with a raw, agonizing emotion that tore violently at my heart. "My success was forged entirely by the blood and sweat of the woman standing in the spotlight right now. While some parents in this room were busy hiding their massive wealth in offshore accounts, my mother was working 2 grueling, back-breaking physical labor jobs simultaneously just to keep the basic electricity turned on in our tiny apartment. When I was 10 and suffered a severe physical injury requiring immediate orthopedic surgery, the man sitting in the front row completely ignored my mother's desperate, weeping phone calls. Why? Because he was too busy sipping expensive cocktails at an extravagant, high-end resort vacation down in Miami. So, my mother walked alone through a blinding, freezing winter blizzard in the middle of the night. She sold her grandmother's antique gold wedding ring to a complete stranger at a dingy pawn shop. She permanently traded away her only cherished family keepsake just to pay for my medical care and physically save my life. A horrifying, suffocating, and completely dead silence rapidly descended upon the 400 seated guests packed tightly into the grand auditorium. The collective breathing of the entire room seemed to stop all at once. You could have heard a single pin drop onto the thick, carpeted floor. The air in the room grew incredibly icy and impossibly dense, charged with a sudden, volatile electricity. The shocking, brutal revelation hung heavily over the crowd like a sharp executioner's blade. Slowly, inevitably, the heads of the wealthy people sitting in the second row, the third row, and all the way back, began to physically turn. Dozens upon dozens of shocked, utterly appalled faces pivoted sharply away from the bright stage. They locked their collective, glaring gazes firmly onto Julian. The polite admiration and respectful nods he had happily received earlier completely evaporated into thin air. It was replaced instantly by an intense, overwhelming wave of absolute disgust and extreme, burning contempt. Julian visibly shrank down into his luxurious velvet chair, his perfectly tanned face rapidly draining of all color. He was suddenly trapped, physically pinned down under the crushing, suffocating weight of 400 pairs of furious, intensely judging eyes. The crushing silence did not last. The sheer, suffocating weight of 400 pairs of accusatory eyes was simply too much for Chloe's fragile ego to bear. The heavy diamond tennis bracelets on her slender wrists clinked frantically together as her hands began to shake with uncontrollable, highly defensive rage. She absolutely could not handle the intense, burning heat of public shaming radiating from the elite members of her social circle. Suddenly, she sprang to her feet, her velvet chair scraping violently and loudly against the polished hardwood floor. Her perfectly constructed high society facade shattered completely into pieces. She thrust a violently trembling, perfectly manicured finger blindly into the bright, blinding beam of the spotlight where I stood completely frozen. "This is absolute, unhinged insanity!" Chloe shrieked at the top of her lungs, her shrill, piercing voice echoing horribly through the massive hall and completely destroying the solemn, respectful atmosphere of the ceremony. Do not listen to a single, pathetic word of this fabricated, dramatic nonsense. That woman hiding in the corner is nothing but a deeply bitter, entirely unstable ex-wife who has spent the last 10 years doing absolutely nothing but psychologically manipulating a highly vulnerable, impressionable child. She is actively brainwashing him right in front of your eyes. She is desperately trying to play the professional victim to deliberately ruin our perfectly pristine reputation because she is incredibly jealous of the massive empire and the beautiful life we have built without her. Chloe's sudden, furious, and highly inappropriate outburst completely derailed the formal proceedings. Several senior faculty members seated on the stage gasped out loud, and wealthy parents in the surrounding rows began murmuring aggressively, deeply shocked by the blatant, trashy display of anger in such a highly prestigious, historically quiet setting. Yet, standing tall up on the high, illuminated stage, Liam did not physically flinch even a fraction of an inch. He did not raise his deep voice to shout over her shrill accusations, nor did he look the least bit embarrassed by the sudden, ugly chaos erupting in the premium front row. He simply stood completely still behind the heavy carved wooden podium. He slowly, methodically lowered the silver microphone just an inch from his mouth and stared silently down at his father's new, furious wife. The intense look burning in my son's eyes was not explosive anger, nor was it a fiery, uncontrollable hatred. It was something far more devastating and permanent. It was a look of profound, chilling, and absolute pity. He looked down at her as if she were a remarkably tragic, deeply broken creature desperately thrashing around in a miserable trap of her own making. His absolute, highly composed, and chilling silence in the face of her screaming. red-faced hysteria instantly drained all the power from her words, making her look incredibly unhinged, wild, and deeply pathetic to the hundreds of people watching her meltdown. Without breaking his piercing eye contact with the frantic woman below him, Liam calmly reached his right hand deep inside the hidden inner pocket of his flowing dark blue academic robe. He did not rush his movements. Every single action he took was highly deliberate, incredibly calculated, and executed with lethal precision. He slowly pulled out a small, severely crinkled piece of faded yellow paper, carefully held together by a rusty staple, along with a thick stack of brightly colored, highly glossy printed photographs. He stepped confidently out from behind the safety of the heavy wooden podium and walked directly to the very extreme edge of the elevated stage, hovering right above the VIP section. He looked straight up toward the high balcony at the back of the room, where the event's professional audio and visual camera crew was frantically working the controls. "I need the camera operator to zoom all the way in on these items right now," Liam commanded clearly, his deep voice carrying a demanding, undeniable authority. "I want every single person in this auditorium to look at the giant screen and see exactly what psychological manipulation actually looks like." He held the fragile, yellowed piece of paper incredibly high above his head, keeping his arm perfectly steady so the main, high-definition event camera could focus its lens perfectly. Then, he raised his other hand, holding up the vibrant, glossy photographs, slowly fanning them out widely like a deck of highly damning, undeniable playing cards for the entire world to witness. Less than 2 seconds later, the massive, state-of-the-art digital projector screen hanging high above the back of the stage flickered wildly. The live video feed instantly switched from a wide shot of Liam's face to an incredibly crisp, massively magnified view of the specific evidence he held tightly in his hands. A collective, entirely unified, and deeply horrified gasp violently tore through the packed auditorium. Projected in massive, towering proportions for everyone to read was the absolute, undeniable truth. First, the crowd clearly saw the faded, officially stamped receipt from a notoriously low-end, dangerous city pawnshop, distinctly and undeniably dated the exact same freezing winter night I had stood crying in the sleet over half a decade ago. It clearly, explicitly listed my grandmother's antique, incredibly rare gold wedding ring, tragically sold for a disgustingly low, practically worthless fraction of its true monetary value, right beside that heartbreaking, highly personal document. The massive screen flashed high-resolution, wildly colorful images of Julian. There he was, captured in vibrant, sickening, undeniable detail on that exact same date, standing casually by a crystal-clear, highly exclusive Miami resort swimming pool. He was laughing uproariously with his head thrown back, an incredibly thick, highly expensive imported cigar clamped firmly between his bright white teeth, holding a massive, oversized glass bottle of top-tier imported champagne, while completely surrounded by a large crowd of wealthy, cheering partygoers. The sheer, undeniable visual contrast between a desperate mother's heartbreaking, agonizing sacrifice and a wealthy father's gluttonous, completely selfish indulgence was totally irrefutable. The entire auditorium erupted into a massive, uncontrollable wave of pure, unfiltered outrage. Loud, angry shouts, and deeply disgusted, visceral groans heavily echoed off the high marble walls as the undeniable, factual reality of Julian's profound cruelty was publicly broadcasted in high definition for the entire elite academic community to judge. The absolute rising chaos in the massive room finally forced the highly strict, aging headmistress into immediate, decisive action. Her wrinkled face was bright red with a volatile mixture of profound personal shock and strict, unyielding institutional fury. She marched aggressively and quickly to the very edge of the stage, her sensible heels clicking sharply and loudly against the polished wood. "That is absolutely more than enough," she boomed loudly over the secondary stage microphone, her stern voice dripping with sheer, terrifying authority. "This is a highly sacred, deeply important academic ceremony meant to honor our hardest working students, not a theatrical stage for your shameful, highly disruptive personal outbursts. She glared fiercely and menacingly down at Chloe, who was now standing completely frozen, her face drained of all its artificial color. Suddenly realizing the massive, completely irreversible social suicide she had just committed in front of her most important peers, the headmistress immediately turned and frantically signaled to the back of the hall. "Security personnel, I need you down here immediately. Escort this highly disruptive woman off the academy grounds right this very instant. She is permanently banned from returning to this campus." The young, previously timid security guard, who had unfairly banished me to the shadows, suddenly appeared at a full sprint, accompanied by two much larger, highly intimidating, uniformed officers. They quickly and efficiently flanked Chloe, grabbing her firmly by her expensive, designer-clad elbows, and began forcibly marching her aggressively up the main center aisle toward the grand exit doors, while the furious, highly wealthy crowd openly glared and muttered, deeply disgusted, biting insults directly at her passing, humiliated figure. Julian was suddenly left completely and utterly alone in the sprawling bus, highly visible VIP section, fully exposed to the harsh lights and actively drowning in a state of utter, undeniable panic. His heavily manicured, carefully crafted public image was completely shattered into a million, totally irreparable pieces right before his very eyes. The highly arrogant, excessively wealthy businessman who had completely ignored my existence just an hour ago was now sweating profusely, his perfectly coiffed, expensive hair suddenly looking highly disheveled and frantic, desperate to wildly salvage even a tiny, pathetic shred of his entirely ruined dignity in front of his deeply judging, wealthy peers. He frantically stood up from his velvet chair. His hands were physically shaking with intense fear as he reached out desperately toward the high stage. "Liam, please, my son, you have to stop this and listen to me right now." Julian stammered incredibly loudly, his previously smooth voice cracking horribly and painfully under the crushing, suffocating pressure of the massive crowd's intense hatred. "You are completely and entirely misunderstanding the complex situation. We can absolutely fix this terrible misunderstanding right now. I am entirely prepared to fully establish a massive, multi-million-dollar family inheritance scholarship fund entirely and exclusively in your name, right this very second. I swear it. We can permanently secure your entire financial future, completely pay for any elite university you ever want to attend, completely free and clear with absolutely zero debt. Just please, I am begging you, step down here and let us discuss this privately like rational, loving family members." It was a truly pathetic, deeply disgusting, and utterly transparent final attempt to use his massive, overwhelming wealth to desperately buy his way out of the highly severe, entirely public consequences he had so rightfully and thoroughly earned. Julian's pathetic, money-scented promise was the final spark that ignited the ultimate climax of the morning. His desperate attempt to buy forgiveness hung in the heavy air, stinking of pure arrogance and profound delusion, up on the elevated stage. Liam did not even bother leaning back into the silver microphone. He simply turned his back on the heavy wooden podium and walked deliberately down the side steps, descending directly onto the main auditorium floor. He marched straight toward the velvet rope of the VIP section and stood mere inches away from the man who had abandoned us. Liam looked straight into the terrified, wide eyes of his deadbeat father. "Keep your dirty money," Liam stated firmly, his deep voice carrying enough natural power for the first 10 rows to hear perfectly without any amplification. "I completely reject every single dime of your hollow inheritance. I do not need it, and I certainly do not want it. Through my own relentless hard work and the absolute, unwavering support of my mother, I have already earned a 100% full academic scholarship to the most prestigious university in this country. My tuition, my housing, and my future are already entirely paid for. I did it completely on my own." Julian opened his mouth, desperately trying to formulate another pathetic excuse, But Liam cut him off with the most devastating, earth-shattering blow of the entire day. "And I no longer need your legacy, either," Liam declared, his voice ringing with absolute, unbreakable certainty. As of 8 o'clock this very morning, a city judge officially struck his gavel and legally finalized my petition. I am no longer your son in any capacity. My legal last name is officially Morris. I proudly carry the name of the woman who actually raised me. That final, monumental revelation completely destroyed whatever tiny shred of hope Julian was frantically clinging to. His knees buckled visibly, and he collapsed heavily back into the cold, velvet VIP chair. He looked entirely defeated, completely hollowed out, and finally realizing the permanent magnitude of his loss. Almost instantly, a solitary clap echoed from the third row, then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium of 400 wealthy, privileged guests rose to their feet in a massive, deafening standing ovation. But they were not clapping for the valedictorian on the stage anymore. The massive crowd physically turned away from the VIP section, shifting their collective gaze toward the dark, shadowed corner by the emergency exit. Slowly, the sea of people began to move aside, deliberately parting down the middle to create a massive, wide-open path leading straight to me. Liam did not hesitate for a single second. He sprinted down the newly formed aisle, his dark blue academic robe flowing rapidly behind him. I stepped completely out of the shadows, tears streaming freely down my face, no longer caring about my worn, second-hand silk dress or my exhausted appearance. When Liam reached me, he immediately pulled the heavy, bright gold honor stole from around his own neck and gently draped it over my shoulders. He wrapped his arms tightly around me, burying his face in my shoulder, and we both wept uncontrollably in a moment of pure, overwhelming, and absolute victory. We stood right there in the middle of the grand hall, bathed in the camera flashes of 100 smartphones, capturing the most radiant, genuinely happy picture ever taken, with my cheap blue hydrangeas pressed firmly between us. Many months later, the cold shadows of that auditorium felt like a distant, faded memory. Sitting in my bright, newly renovated private office, I looked out over the massive floor of Zenith Core Logistics. I had just been officially promoted to the position of Senior Operations Manager, finally earning the substantial salary and deep respect I had fought so fiercely to achieve. As I sipped my warm morning coffee, my personal phone rang. It was Liam, calling from his massive university library across the country, eagerly bragging about his perfect midterm grades. Listening to his vibrant, incredibly happy voice, I smiled with a profound, unbreakable sense of peace. The storm was finally over, and our beautiful new morning had arrived. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Boss Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.